and welcome to my interview with Susan Austin, local author and past president of the Berkeley Historical Society. I'm Jeanine Castello-Lin, current vice president of the Berkeley Historical Society, and today is December 2nd, 2022, and Susan Austin is in Berkeley, and we are going to be talking about Julia Morgan, because I think this is backwards for you, but this is drawing outside the lines. It's a new novel by Susan Austin, just came out this year, and very exciting. I think it makes Julia Morgan into a real girl and young woman, a real person, and that's something that a lot of people have struggled to do. So kudos, Susan.
Yep.
And so we're going to talk about your novel and some of the research you did, and about Julia Morgan. Yeah, I think to just sort of place how Julia Morgan has been presented so far, I think she's been a bit inscrutable. Would you say that people have had a hard time making her into a flesh and blood person? And do you want to say a little bit about how you went about making her into a flesh and blood person?
Well, I would like to begin with two things. One, I need to correct you, Jeanine. I was the vice president of the Historical Society.
Okay.
The inscrutable nature of Julia Morgan, it's a great place to start any discussion. And I agree with you, but she has been like that for us for very specific reasons. And it has to do with her own temperament, her own personality, her own intense sense of privacy. So she wasn't out there giving interviews, talking about herself. She didn't write about herself. Anybody who is familiar with Julia Morgan is familiar with a very famous saying she has made about herself when people ask her, who are you and why are you doing what you're doing? Her answer was always the same. If you want to know who I am, look at what I've done, look at my work. And in fact, she poured her life into her work. It was everything to her. And she cared least about public acclaim and public understanding of who she was. So that makes her a very difficult subject, and very little writing by her about herself and her life. But there are some sources which give us a clue, and those sources were really important to my fleshing out Julia Morgan as a real person, a person with strengths and a person with weaknesses, foibles, flaws, but a driven person. And so that's why this novel is a novel. Writing about Julia Morgan based on the really small sources we have is very difficult, and doesn't create a real living flesh and blood person unless you dig really deep.
Yes, which I think you did, and you used your imagination, and your character, your Julia Morgan character, is very historically situated, in the sense that you imagine the new technologies which Julia would have seen, and which would have fired her imagination and fueled her ambition. So the scene that you set at the beginning of the novel in Brooklyn, and you tell us that Julia is going to see something really amazing in Brooklyn, which is really great. You create this tension, and so maybe you can tell us a little bit about what she saw, and that was, I believe, 1883, and what she saw and how that connected to her dreams later on.
So, Jeanine, you're speaking of the Brooklyn Bridge, which had its grand opening in 1883. including not only this amazing engineering feat of this suspension bridge that took, I believe, 14 years to build, but it also included electric lights, which was pretty amazing. Now, those of you who've been on over across the Brooklyn Bridge, you probably walked on the pedestrian walkway down the middle of it. And then down below, you'll have the traffic going probably today in two directions and probably public transportation. But in 1883, the bridge had the pedestrian park walkway, and then it had one road for animals and horses, and the other, I'm not sure what the other one was, but it was a different place, but it was an exciting engineering feat. And Julia Morgan's grandparents lived within walking distance in Brooklyn Heights, really close to the bridge. They could probably see the bridge from her grandparents' home, which was 51 Remsen Street. And she and her family visited from Oakland to New York several times to visit the grandparents for baby namings. There were 5 little Morgans, for funerals. So there was regular traffic, and it was made easier by the Transcontinental Railway, which was finished and ended in Oakland at about that. Well, I'm not sure of the actual dates. I think it was maybe if this is 83, I think it was in the 1870s, when the Transcontinental completed its trek to Oakland. So she was there rather regularly. Was she there for the actual first year of the Brooklyn Bridge's opening? I don't know. But I do know that she watched it, and she and her father watched that bridge develop. They followed the Oakland Tribune articles on it. I'm guessing because it was right there in front of them. There were regular updates on the status of the Brooklyn Bridge. It was a major event in our country. So I know she was aware of it. I don't think she was there in 83. But I do know that she had been there several times. And the other part about that story that was fun to create was, first of all, researching the building of that bridge, which is an amazing story. And there are many books. By the way, I don't think we mentioned my audience, Jeanine. This book is written for a younger audience. It doesn't exclude the adults who enjoy it thoroughly. It's for 10 and up. And when I say up, I mean 10 all the way up. But there are some wonderful books out for the younger crowd on the building of the Brooklyn Bridge, and I encourage everybody to check those out, look at it. It's a fascinating story. In my mind, that story, that development of that bridge and watching it grow up had to be an influence on Julia Morgan as a young child. So I put her on that bridge along with one of her cousins who married into the family, an architect, Pierre Lebrun, who was the son of an architect and part of the Lebrun architectural company that included the 2 sons and the father. And so I know that Julia Morgan knew him, and I knew they had a correspondence over the years, especially when she was studying architecture in France. So I put him on the bridge too in that opening chapter. The 2 of them admiring and talking about what went into building that bridge, and also included another major event that was going on at that same moment that we know Julia Morgan must have been aware of as well, which was the building of the Statue of Liberty. Yes. And they could see it from the bridge. So all those pieces came together for me in a moment of inspiration for Julia Morgan, where she knew this was a really exciting thing to see and something she wanted to hold on to, that feeling of excitement for the rest of her life. Yes. So that's the first chapter.
Yes. So I think, yes, it really grounds your Julia in a historical period and makes it explicable that Julia would be so driven to accomplish building feats which had not been previously possible. So steel, and then, if I'm correct, reinforced concrete, which had steel inside. Is that right? Which
Yes,
is what Julia used. So that was really key, and which allowed her buildings, for example, the El Campinel at the Mills campus, or I think buildings, the
City
Lawson
Club,
House.
the City
Pardon?
Club, the
The City
Berkeley
Club.
City Club,
So
good
it
example.
allowed these buildings to withstand the earthquake, the 1906
Oh,
earthquake,
the earth,
and
yes.
then the later earthquake, 1989 earthquake. So there is a real connection between this moment of discovery of steel and then Julia Morgan's work. And I almost, I was thinking about how children, particularly, I guess, boys in the late 50s and early 60s might have been very excited by the possibilities of space exploration, going to the moon, and they would like, I want to be an astronaut, or I want to make rockets or something. And that would be completely explicable. It would explain a child's drive and desire to work really hard. And I thought you did something similar with Julia Morgan, explaining, because Pierre Lebrun goes on and talks about how he wants to build skyscrapers. So this is a new era in which people could imagine almost like flying, like we can go up into the sky with this steel. So I thought that was very effective.
Good point, Jeanine. Really good point about parallels in history and key moments. Very good.
Yeah. But the difference is that Julia's a girl. So if it had been a boy who had been so excited by the possibility of building steel buildings, then we went, oh yeah, that makes sense. But Julia was a girl, and maybe we can go now back to Oakland and see what difficulties being a girl with this desire to build upward created for her. What was Oakland like then, and why? What was its raison d'être? Why was there a wealthy kind of establishment there?
First of all, let me mention, yes, she was born 1872, which makes this year her sesquicentennial year. She was born 150 years ago. So yay, Julia.
Okay.
And we're still talking about her. That's pretty amazing.
Yes.
Oakland. So Oakland was very interesting. That there was a lot of what's the right word, competition between Oakland and San Francisco, even in those early days. But Oakland, it was known to San Franciscans for its beautiful gardens and flowers and trees, oak trees everywhere. I mean, obviously, but we don't see them so much today, but many, many oak trees. And it was horse and buggy time, 1872, dirt roads, but it was a place where San Franciscans would get on the ferry, go to Oakland, and take a stroll among the gardens and the trees. So I would urge everybody, if they haven't gone yet to Preservation Park in Oakland, to take a peek at it, because those Victorian homes that they preserved and created this little neighborhood for, it's like a few blocks from where Julia Morgan grew up in Oakland, and it captures some of the feel of what it looked like. I think they were just starting to improve roads and sidewalks at around that time, just starting to get rid of wooden sidewalks and doing a better job with roads so they weren't muddy holes and things like that. But beautiful homes, and yes, there were businesses as well, and there was Broadway was downtown, and it was very different from San Francisco. Now, I don't know, but I'm going to guess at that time, San Francisco did have some 5-story high buildings, but I don't know if Oakland did. I'm not a student of Oakland history, but I needed to know what it was like for her to grow up in it. And one wonderful source for understanding what early Oakland was like in 1870s came from an oral history that I used extensively in the Bancroft Library. It was an oral history by a woman who gave this made the oral history at the age of 94. She had an amazing memory, and she was a peer of Julia Morgan. She lived at the same time. In fact, her name was Mary McLean, and I used her. She was a perfect best friend for Julia Morgan.
Yes.
Same age. They knew they were in the same sorority. Eventually, they were friends as young adults. Whether they were childhood friends, I really don't know. But Mary McLean tells details about what it was like to be a child growing up in Oakland. So if you want a picture of that, read the book and read carefully what the two girls did together before they started high school, even. Because that's Mary McLean's story, and it's lovely. It gives you a good feel for the city.
Yes, yes. No, you definitely created a real place, and one of the key places in Oakland was Oakland High.
Oh yeah,
which and it was very interesting that Oakland High was considered very prestigious, difficult to get into, and a magnet for people. You said that people would come and maybe have their children board with someone who lived in Oakland so that the child could go to Oakland High,
right.
or move to Oakland. So that was very interesting. And I was wondering, was one of the reasons that Oakland was so attractive because it was a feeder school to UC Berkeley?
Yeah, I don't know that. I don't think so. I mean, the concept of a feeder school, I think, is more contemporary. I think finishing up at Oakland High was quite an achievement. And I feel not too many went on to college as might happen today at a prestigious high school. So I don't know if I would use those words, but yes, it was there were not a lot of high schools. It was clearly one of the earliest and considered one of the best in the state. And yes, there would be, and one of my characters is the son of missionaries from Hawaii. Somewhere I picked up in my research the fact that students would come from afar and board with Oakland families. So I have this young man whose family sends him to Oakland High School so that he can graduate from there and then maybe go on to college, which he does in this story.
Yes.
He was an entirely fictional character. Most of my characters are not fictional. They really did exist, but he's a fictional composite.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, in terms of Julia's path, the fact that Oakland High was so rigorous, it was very important. It meant that Julia got a very good education and was well prepared to study at UC Berkeley. And you mentioned in particular mechanical drawing, that she really excelled at mechanical drawing, which gave her the courage and the confidence to pursue civil engineering at Berkeley. I mean, this seems like this was her dream, that she had decided she wanted to be an architect. There was no school of architecture at Berkeley, so civil engineering was the closest thing. And you have Julia, extremely hardworking at Oakland High, and her, on the one hand, Julia is being a model child by working so hard and being so successful, being recognized at au contraire. On the other hand, she is almost rebelling against the expectations of a young woman, because she's working so hard that she cannot come out as a debutante. She can't play these social roles. And that's a big part of the story.
She didn't want to. It's
She
not
didn't.
that she couldn't. No, she didn't want to. That was not, I mean, that is one piece of her story that we know a little more about, the debutante story. No, she didn't want that. That she
Okay.
had no time for that. That was wasteful time. She was very driven, as you said, Jeanine. But no, debutante and dances and staying out late and partying. No. So that's that story. The Berkeley High story is very important. She had a mentor there, and having a mentor who believes in you and encourages you is a huge thing in a young person's life, as we know. So that was hugely important to her, and she chose what was then called the science track. You had to pick like a major in high school, so she picked the science track. She knew that from the beginning, and it happened. She was in an ideal school, in an ideal place to achieve that dream. The other thing I wanted to mention about the engineering program and the architecture dream, I don't exactly know when she decided she wanted to be an architect. It sort of evolved.
Mm-hmm.
It evolved. I mean, nobody really will ever know that, but I see it as evolving. And having a mentor like her name was Molly Connors, really, really was inspirational to her. And then at Cal, she, with the encouragement of Connors and perhaps her father as well, and the support of her mother, she finally did decide on engineering. And that is where she learned so much about reinforced concrete. That's the place and the time. It was a big focus of the program, or important focus of the program.
Yeah.
So, but high school, the one last thing I wanted before you move from high school, if you do, high school was wood. It was Victorian in style, and it had all the wooden curlicues of a typical 3-story Victorian building. And if you look in the book, you'll see a wonderful sketch of the high school as it existed then. It no longer exists. But while Julia was there, it burned down. It had major fires twice and closed the school down for 2 major periods of her junior, senior years at high school. It really did happen. And you could read about this, the high school in the Oakland Tribune, how it looked, and there was even, in fact, an architect's critique of that building as being a horrid example of Victorian architecture. And so again, I could imagine a discussion in Julia Morgan's home about the high school and how it looked, and how maybe they were a little glad it burned down twice, or it lost several floors twice.
Yes. And it was replaced by brick. Is that correct?
Eventually, yes, it became a huge brick building. Yeah, that was about 5 years later.
Yeah. Right. So yes, you're right. I was going to go on to UC Berkeley, and you have a lot of scenes depicting what UC Berkeley was like for a woman between 1890 and 94, when Julia Morgan was there. And maybe you can tell us a little bit about the expectations for women joining, because there was this status of being a special student. I mean, there were women at Berkeley, but there were almost none, it sounds like, in the civil engineering program.
Correct. No, very few women. There
Right.
were some that preceded her. She wasn't the first,
Mm-hmm.
but I believe in her class she might have been the only. Very few.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, there was this category of a special student, which women tended to choose. But I also want to add, it was a period when women were just starting to be heard, to be able to, well, I think the sorority is a great example of this. She joined one of the first sororities on campus. They called themselves a fraternity, and in fact, still do refer to themselves as a fraternity, Kappa Alpha Theta, the cats. And that was a great example of women on campus, and there were women on campus. They were generally studying literature or languages, and they might have gone on to teach. Of them coming together and supporting each other, because it was tough. I mean, the school was built around the needs and the possibilities for men, not for women. So they were always viewed a little bit outside the box. And one way I got a sense, I mean, I read a lot about this period, and I looked at a lot of secondary sources. But one very interesting source I like to use, I think images are powerful. So I used access to the yearbook, the blue and gold, which I know the Historical Society has some on your shelves. In fact, I think I went in at one point to look at one I wanted to get a closer look at. Am I right, Jeanine? You have
Yes.
some?
Uh-huh.
I
Mm-hmm.
think you do. One of the images that's just stuck in my mind is a cartoon that was drawn in one of the yearbooks of this period when Julia's a student. It shows a freshman woman walking in, beautiful dress, looking very feminine. And then it shows her 4 years later graduating with a mortar board on her head, a black gown, hair severe, and glasses, dark, round glass frames. And it was a commentary in my mind. It's a commentary on, well, they come in as these feminine, lovely little malleable creatures, and they go out something else. And I don't know how I feel about that something else, this educated, smart, self-assured woman. And I think it kind of captures the time. Yes, there were women there, and yes, they were involved in all aspects of life, as far as I could tell on campus, but they had no meeting place. Like the men had all these places they could gather, and they could sit on this bench, and they could go to that hall, and they could do all these things. Women, they just had a basement room in South Hall where they would convene and meet and support each other. And so it was, being a woman on campus, it was clearly possible. It was for very few special women. They formed very deep bonds, I think, after post-college. But this was Victorian times. This was very difficult.
Yes. And I guess the expectation for most of these women was that they would finish their degree, they might teach for a few years, they would get married, have children immediately, and that would be the end of their career. And so,
Which was the same for architecture. The few women that thought they wanted to be architects at this time, very few went on. And I understand from architects, it wasn't so different for a very long time. Going on in architecture as a woman was really tough. And then that, I think it meant too that if you're an architect, you've got to be able to tell men what to do. That's a hard thing.
Yes. Well, I think one of the factors might have been the age by which a woman was expected to have married.
Yes.
Because you mentioned that Julia, by the time she came back from Paris,
yeah,
she was too old to get married, and so and I guess there wasn't commonly used birth control, but because it's if you had to get married by a certain age, and as soon as you got married, you had children. Well, there was no time for a career unless you were very wealthy, I suppose, and you had some nanny to take care of the children all the time.
I think that's how Julia Morgan saw it. I think she saw she had a choice. You couldn't do both. You
Yeah.
couldn't be married, have children, and have a career. It was an either or choice. Although you could be a music teacher and have lessons at home, but it was very difficult, not impossible. Some did it, she did it, but she had to make a choice. I'm not gonna, I have to make a choice. And if for her, it was a no-brainer. That's what it was gonna be. Architecture all the way.
Yes. Well, I have to say that your depiction of how the men in the main treated Julia Morgan in high school and at UC Berkeley would explain why someone would be not so eager to get married, because she was treated terribly, pretty much, in your book. She was poking her nose in an area where she shouldn't. She had no excuse being there, and she was besting a lot of the men, and they really resented her. So you can imagine your Julia wanting to go off, and her main desire being to prove that she could do these things, and rather than submitting to some other man who might tell her, where's my dinner, or where's this or that.
I don't know, Jeanine. I just think it was never part of her mindset. I I don't know. Nobody will ever really know. But it was all about the work. It's what she loved. It's what she was passionate about. It's all she wanted to do. So I think it was more that than a rejection of other. I think. I'd love to have a discussion with others about this, but I think it was more a choice than turning her back on that, you know.
Yeah. So there was one other woman who you mentioned, who's a real woman, who did sort of buck the system a little bit. That's Jessica Picciotto.
Yes.
And she became important in terms of Julia's travel to Paris. Do you want to tell us a little bit about what transpired?
Jessica Picciotto was an older student in the same class as Julia Morgan, older by many years, but they did develop a relationship, and they were in some similar classes, and so they were friends. I do know that Jessica Picciotto was also a personal friend of Frank Norris, who is in the book, the author of The Octopus. He was in the same class. It was a very illustrious class at UC Berkeley. So Jessica Picciotto was this older, mature student, and I imagine that two of the young women gravitated towards each other and became friends. And of course, Jessica Picciotto had no time to join a sorority or do any of that. But she graduated in Julia's class. Julia Morgan didn't decide to go. It took her a couple years post graduation from UC Berkeley to head off to the École for a whole number of reasons. And when she did decide, she was going to go with Arthur Brown, who was another classmate of hers from Oakland High and from UC Berkeley, architect, son of an architect. Arthur Brown, I think, he did the, he designed the San Francisco City Hall, I think, is Arthur Brown. Anyhow, he and his mother were going to go with Julia Morgan, accompany her on her way to the École, where Arthur Brown was going to enroll as an architecture student too. But he got sick. You're the mother. Do you remember, Jeanine? I think it was the mother got sick. Who got sick?
The
mother got sick.
Mother got sick. Yeah.
Yeah, the mother got sick.
Arthur went alone, and then it was no longer appropriate for Julia to go with Arthur without the chaperone of the mother.
Correct.
Yes.
So she despaired, but then Jessica Picciotto wrote her and said, little notes, hand notes were very important. communication in this time. Jessica Peixoto wrote and said, I'm going to study at the Sorbonne, and you're going to the École. And so the two did travel together on the train across the country, and then on the boat to Paris. So yeah, it's a good story. And Jessica Peixoto became quite a figure on campus here at UC Berkeley. She studied political or social political economy, or
yes.
Yeah. Do you remember, Jeanine, what it was?
Yeah, I think she came back and then to Berkeley and got an advanced degree and even taught in, I guess, burgeoning and sort of field between sociology and political science.
Yeah.
Economics. Yeah.
Which became her work and the program that she designed at Cal became the early School of Social Welfare as it exists today. So Jessica Peixoto is played a really huge role on campus. Yes, she got an honorary PhD, doctorate, I believe, from Berkeley. I believe that's how.
And so she never married. Is that right?
Peixoto? I don't believe so. Again,
see, another example.
You couldn't be, do all these things. You couldn't do both.
Yes, unless you chose to have a woman as a partner, and then it might be possible. Anyhow, that's a thought.
Good thought. Interesting thought.
Yes. So Paris, that was a big chunk of Julia's life, and that really gave her the training to be the amazing architect that she became. But it took a long time, an incredible amount of perseverance. What you want to tell us a little bit about what was the program by which one got into the École des Beaux-Arts?
Well, the fact is that Julia Morgan was the first woman in that program, and I think the expert on Julia Morgan in Paris is Dr. Karen McNeil. And the two new books that have come out about Julia Morgan this year, the one by Victoria Kastner, and the other is an edited book in which there is a chapter by Karen McNeil on the Paris years. Give you some of that background. I'm not an expert on the Paris years. I do send you to anything that Karen McNeil has written about this topic. She's exceedingly knowledgeable, and everything I know by listening to her and reading her work. But I do know it was a rough program. It was a program that was not embarrassed to hide their sexism. So there was a lot of discrimination against Julia Morgan. She was a tough woman, a tough, tiny woman, very tiny, hardly 5 feet, hardly 100 pounds, and tough as nails. And she was not easily defeated. So it was a struggle. And then she came back to California, headlines in the newspaper, young girl makes good in Paris. And she becomes the first licensed female architect in California. So, I mean, that's great story. There are many better sources than me about Julia Morgan's Paris years, but it's for the most recent coverage, those two books. Oh, I didn't bring them here. I should have been waving them.
It's okay. Yes. But you do mention, I think, in your book, or maybe in the epilogue, that one of the first things that Julia Morgan did when she came back was help with the designing and engineering of the Greek theater.
Yeah.
Which was, I mean, it's obviously a very unusual role for a woman, because there you're dealing with enormous public building and concrete and just the kind of thing that a woman wouldn't normally do.
Yeah, well, there are a couple things about that kind of tickle my mind. One is the backstory of the Greek theater. I want to just do a little bit of that because that's great, and that's in the book. But the other is what she actually did when she came back. And reason that is sometimes provided for why Julia Morgan was so private and refused to talk to the press as much as she could was that she early on in she was sometimes referred to as an interior decorator, which really bothered her deeply. So the work that she did at the Greek Theater, it was unfinished, and the President Roosevelt was coming to speak on campus, and here they had this perfect structure for his venue to speak, but it was undone. It wasn't finished. And a lot of what she did right away was to create a facade of finishedness, if you would, with creating a background, an environment, a place, a distinguished place for the president that was not an unfinished Greek theater. So, and then she helped, of course, complete the task. But that was the first thing. Get it looking right, Julia. We have a dignitary coming, which she did brilliantly. And then the other part of this is the story of the Greek theater. Until I did my research, I was totally unaware of this, but there was a tradition at Cal that the senior class would put on this sort of pageant. And it was always done in front of a building, and nobody could see anything or hear anything. But it was a lark. But as I mentioned, this was an extraordinary class, the class of '94. So I encourage you to read the book and read the story of the first gathering of anybody where the Greek theater sits today and its relationship to the class of '94. I'm not going to say more than that.
Yes, that's a good teaser. Yes, and that was a surprise to me. I did not know about the evolution of that spot.
Yes,
as a
very
theater.
cool. Good story.
Yes. Well, what you said about Julia being very concerned about the formal aesthetic aspect of the Greek theater sort of ties into the formal civic kind of architecture, which she did, which was, I guess, the kind that would be what she was trained to do at the École des Beaux-Arts. And maybe in Berkeley, we're not as familiar with that as the brown shingle, the first bay tradition, which is what people often here in Berkeley associate Julia Morgan with. So maybe we should talk about, first Julia Morgan went to work in John Galen Howard's office in San Francisco. And then she got her license, and she opened her own studio, which was a extraordinarily productive studio. And she had a lot of men working for her. She had a couple of women whom she tried to mentor. And she ended up doing a lot of work for the YWCA. And just in her work for the YWCA, we can see both the very formal École des Beaux-Arts kind of buildings and then the First Bay tradition. So I don't know if you want to talk about that a little bit.
It's quite an interesting point. Julia Morgan was exceedingly eclectic as an architect. So you can see that classical style. Go to the City Club, for goodness sakes, or look at the Hearst Gymnasium and look at that. That's your classical. In fact, they called Julia's work at the City Club the Little Castle. It's classic. It's lovely, beautiful, stunning architecture. Yes. And then there are modest little homes that you would never know were at Julia Morgan, though Karen McNeil would know. Ask her. So one of Julia Morgan's characteristics was wanting to meet the needs of the client, and I think that's when you look at her work, that's what you need to think about. How in the world was she able to work for nearly 30 years with William Randolph Hearst She would try to do the things that he wanted, but she knew how to gently persuade him to do otherwise. But that's an extraordinary relationship. And if anything, indicates her ability to work with people and listen to people and try and respond to their dreams. That's a great story for it.
Yes, you're talking about Hearst Castle in San Simeon, which became this sort of, I would say, over the top kind of project that she got involved in. Yeah.
And unfortunately, some people, it's kind of interesting. Some people think of her mainly as doing that. That was not the case. You know, she was more prolific probably than any living architect today. Over 700 sites are Julia Morgan sites. I mean, that's
incredible. Incredible, yes.
Incredible. But the fact that when I toured the castle the first time, I think it was in let's say the 80s sometime. I had little kids with me. And they didn't even mention Julia Morgan. Not a mention of Julia Morgan. Today it's very different. And that's because of somebody like Victoria Kastner, who spent 30 years as the historian of the Hearst Castle, who has helped elevate partly at Hearst Castle, Julia Morgan's role. So I'm just saying that because she was eclectic. She did all kinds of different work. In fact, I understand she did some mighty fine dog houses in her lifetime. So
yes, yes. Well, maybe we should end by talking a little bit about the City Club as maybe one of the best examples of how Julia Morgan was able to integrate this classical École des Beaux-Arts training with the First Bay tradition. The sort of the entrance, the staircase is very classical and elegant, and then there's a room. It's all wood, right? It's a kind of interior wood with that seems very First Bay. I think inside.
Well, here's a funny thing. Next time you and anybody else goes into the City Club, check out the ceilings. So you can see my ceiling here. It's wood. Mm-hmm. Now go into the City Club and trying to decide which of all those beautiful ceilings are really wood in the tradition that you're describing, and which of those are reinforced concrete. And I'll give you a hint. There's only one that's really wood. Mm-hmm. And it's hard to tell.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, yes.
It's a great building. It's open to the public. It has tours. There's a Sunday once a month where you can take a tour, and it has a beautiful restaurant. You can eat there, have a wonderful meal. It's a hotel. Julia Morgan, you're right, Jeanine. She did a lot of YWs throughout the country. And she did a lot for women, buildings for women. And the City Club is an example of that. It was originally the Berkeley Women's Club. I believe that was what it was called. It was built by women with women's money for women and for them to gather for their philanthropy efforts, but also to house women who were studying or working, like at a YW. And she did a lot of this kind of work. And I don't think we fully understand how much and how important it was.
Yes, we're here in Berkeley. We're probably most familiar with the Asilomar, which was almost entirely First Bay, but had very large sort of like the social hall, the gathering hall, very, very large. I mean, not like a small domestic architecture. So it was a real combination of the two, big, enormous stone fireplace and wood beams, etc. But yeah, definitely.
So that is just as an aside to that. I think that's sort of an advantage of being a woman architect. She was aware of the not only the need to create safe places for women to gather, but places where they could talk and communicate. And if you start to look at her work from that point of view, you start to see a lot of interesting architectural features. All right, here's a case in point. It's a tiny one. So I've just created this hunt for Julia Morgan treasures in Berkeley. And I have 8 sites that I have in the hunt that I'm making this available to whoever's interested. And one of the sites is, you mentioned but you pronounced it better than I'm going to, Jeanine, the Campanile
I think, the El Campanile in
El
Mills,
Campanile,
College.
on the Mills campus. There is a feature there that if you look very carefully, you'll see it's a sweet little indicator of Julia Morgan's desire or interest in giving people a chance to interact. It's bottom. Are you familiar with it, Jeanine? Have you?
Only in the pictures. I've never been to see it in
You
person.
go see it. Look at the there's a bottom floor. It's something very simple, but to me, it's sort of an example of what I'm trying to talk about. There's a space you can stand in the campanile out of the elements, but there are also 2 benches, built-in benches, wood benches, and they're facing each other. It's just a feature, but it's saying, I know they're going to be young at Mills College, Women's College. I know they're going to be people walking by that want to come out of this, maybe the rain, they maybe want to sit and visit. And so I like to use that example as Julia Morgan's sensitivity and humanity.
That's a very good note to end on, because we started with how you made Julia Morgan into real flesh and blood girl and young woman.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you so much, Susan. It was a
Thank you,
pleasure.
Jeanine. Oh, it was great fun for me too.